Well, we begin today's show in Burma, where more than 500 people have been killed during protests against the February 1st military coup that toppled Burma's democratically elected civilian government. At least 141 people were killed on Saturday alone, in the bloodiest day so far, as soldiers opened fire on civilians demonstrating against military rule in dozens of cities and towns across the country. Children were among the dead, including a 5-year-old boy, according to Amnesty International, and a 13-year-old girl. On Sunday, Burmese troops fired on a funeral service for a 20-year-old student protester killed near the commercial capital, Rangoon. The attacks drew condemnation from the European Union, United States, UK, and Germany, with the UN Special Rapporteur for Burma accusing the military regime of mass murder. On Tuesday, U.S. Secretary of State Tony Blinken condemned the crackdown and called for international companies to consider cutting ties to enterprises that support Burma's military.
The people of Burma are speaking clearly. They don't want to live under military rule. And that is evident from what we're seeing and hearing and witnessing. And we continue to call on the military regime to release all those people who've been unjustly detained, stop its attacks on civil society members, journalists, labor unionists, halt the killings by its security forces, and return to power the democratically elected government. The United States is committed to working with its allies and partners to hold the perpetrators of these abhorrent acts accountable.
This comes as human rights activists are calling on international energy companies like Chevron to withhold revenues from natural gas projects they operate in Burma from the junta-controlled government. Meanwhile, an estimated 3,000 people have fled southeastern Burma into Thailand after the Burmese military bombed areas controlled by the Karen ethnic minority group. At least 459 people, including at least 35 children, have been killed since the start of the protests, according to rights groups. Burma is also known as Myanmar. Military leaders changed the name to Myanmar in 1989 after brutally suppressing a pro-democracy uprising. For more, we're joined by Aron Aung. He is from Rangoon, the former capital of Burma, formerly known, that is now called Yangon. He came to the U.S. to attend college and is a senior at the New York Institute of Technology. His recent piece for the college's newspaper called the Manhattan Globe is headlined "Misogyny Silenced, Feminism Amplified." Welcome to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us, Aron. And first of all, I want to say you're incredibly brave to come on this broadcast, to show your face. And I'm wondering if you can talk about what's happening in your home country, talk about your family, and why you've chosen to do this first broadcast interview of your life.
So as we all know, on February 1st, the military took over as a coup in my country. And ever since then, it's been almost over 2 months now. So many people have died. So far, like you said, there have been 550 deaths. And that's just an estimate, with a 7-year-old girl being one of the youngest victims, a 5-year-old boy recently. And the situation back home does not seem to be getting any better. There's some days where, like, you know, people have a little more hope, but most days it's more gloomy. Many of us abroad, we're very worried about people back home. We wake up to more bad news every morning, more deaths. It's just been chaotic. Everyone's really worried from my family, our families, but my family back home, they're staying safe at home, staying indoors, you know, doing our best during these tough times.
And Aron, I'm wondering if you could talk. You mentioned your family, your parents themselves. Have they talked to you about their participation decades ago in the 1980s in the democracy movement? Then, what's different about this movement versus the uprising of young people back then?
Right. So I know that my parents they were a part of like the 1988 revolution. As so many people marched the streets back then. They've told me stories about their crackdowns back then, but the thing is, they also said that the protests back then, they lasted for only about 2 months, because there was like huge military crackdown. But the difference is that back then they didn't have telecommunications and the internet like we do. Nowadays, we're also connected. There's a lot of young people who are also technologically more smart, that are like, now that we have a better sense of like sharing information, we know what to do. Like if we're planning to like do a certain protest today, things are happening. Unlike back then when they had no internet connections or phone calls, so they had to just hide at homes and like surrender to the coup. But what's different about this this time is that we're also connected and everyone's very angry. We're not gonna stop protesting. We're not gonna submit to this military regime. It's time that they end and step down.
And I wanted to ask you a little bit in terms of the history of Burma, because the military has dominated the life of the country ever since it became independent, but it was for 120 years a colony of the British Empire. And the Burmese army was, in essence, sort of created, wasn't it, during the Japanese occupation during World War II by the Japanese fascists? I'm wondering, what's the responsibility of countries like the UK and the rest of the world as you are battling to reestablish democracy?
Right. So the military, it's very deep rooted in our history. Like you said, it was formed during like the Japanese takeover in our country back then. And basically they rose into power when we quote unquote won independence from the British. So what happened was, after we received independence, our father of independence, Aron Aung, he was assassinated, and the country kind of went into turmoil. There was no rulers, so the military stood up and like they took over, and they have not like given back the power to the people since. So it's very deep rooted, and I believe that countries like the United Kingdom and like Japan, all these countries, like they do have a sense of responsibility to a point that this is a very deep-rooted issue, and they should be supporting the people in this modern world that we live in today.
Your piece in the Manhattan Globe, the New York Institute of Technology newspaper, begins, "I remember as a young boy sitting in restaurants and neighborhood tea shops, hearing shh amongst the voices of conversations and the clinking chaos of spoons and ceramic cups. When a police or a soldier's presence was detected, people would stop talking and try to ignore these men in uniforms. One can't help but be intimidated by them." Talk about growing up there and what your parents would say to you about what could be talked about, and now as you desperately try to reach your parents on the phone.
Yeah, so I grew up under the military regime, basically born into it, and the world was just thinking about it. It was a scarier time, but then as a kid, I didn't understand anything, right? Because we would be out in public. Everyone's scared of soldiers. I just thought soldiers were something to be like someone to be scared of, not like loved or appreciated like in other countries like the United States, where Marines and soldiers are like, like congratulated, and like everyone is like everyone, even when you see military like Marines on the streets, people say thank you for your service. But that's not the experience that I had in my country. Instead, we were taught to fear them. Democracy is definitely not a word back then when I was growing up to be talked about. Aung San Suu Kyi, like we couldn't talk about her. We couldn't bring up her name anywhere in public because you never know who's listening. Back then, undercover cops were a huge thing. So even in like tea shops and restaurants, getting breakfast, it's a huge thing. It's a huge culture in my country to go to tea shops in the morning to like catch up and talk about the daily news and stuff. So they purposely would place these undercover cops in these tea shops and restaurants so that they can listen in to the citizens' conversations, prosecute them at will if they may. Yeah, so it was a very interesting growing up experience if I look back to it now.
And you also write about the women-led revolution, which I don't think people hear so much about in Burma. You talked about Aung San, you talked about Aung San Suu Kyi, who was detained by the military on February 1st at the time of the military coup. But the significance of who's in the streets right now, Aron?
Yeah. So a few weeks ago, we had the Tamang Revolution. Tamang is like a sarong or a skirt worn by a traditional sarong worn by the women of Myanmar. Our country has deep-rooted like misogyny, just culture-wise. We have this idea called pon, which is the topic that I talked about in the second article that I wrote for school. Pon, which is like, it's the idea of that men have a higher aura or like not a physical, just like luck, right? Than women. So this idea have been ingrained in all of us. But then throughout, like this has nothing to do with like religion or anything. It's just a cultural thing where we've been raised. But with this revolution, a few weeks ago, women stood up to the front lines, and women have been standing up in this revolution. Women have been on the front lines. They've been showing men, they've been proving all these misogynistic men that they have the power and they can do what these men are doing. And so they started going out on this. They protested, went out on the streets, tied their sarongs to sticks and waved them as flags proudly up in the air. They started tying their longees and their undergarments on the street poles because it's also a belief that men are not to walk underneath these skirts, like women's clothing items and stuff like that. So these soldiers were actually hesitant to cross these lines because they were women's undergarments that were blocking the way. So they had to spend time taking them down, which bought protesters time to run away from them, hide from them. I'm just so happy with people's creativities back home in the ways we protest and how we do it so seamlessly and peacefully.
And Aron, about that issue of the peaceful protests, there have long been ethnic groups in different parts of the country that have resisted the control of the central government. And back in the British colonial period, the British actually pitted different ethnic groups within Burma against each other. I'm wondering how you sense the potential for these the armed groups of the ethnic minorities to unite with the broader peaceful movement that has developed in the cities against the dictatorship.
Correct. Growing up, we were all taught the news media portrayed these ethnic military groups as like rebel groups, right? So until honestly, up until the coup, I also believed that to be true. I just thought that they had these rebel military groups, but little did we know, now that they're speaking up about it, and then now now we find out that this military ethnic cleansing has been going on for way too long, and the people of Burma were unaware of it in the major cities, but all they were trying to do is to protect their own people from the military, and right now, all the so-called rebel groups, but they are no longer rebel groups. They are fighting for us. They're fighting for the people of Myanmar. They have been joining together to form our own military to serve under the CRPH, which is the committee representing Pirazu Lutto, which is the democratic government group that we, the people of Myanmar, have elected in the 2020 elections that have been overthrown.
Finally, are you afraid for your family back in Burma, Aron?
Very. I would like to think that they'd be safe inside their own homes up until recently, but just seeing videos and news of them just barging into people's houses with no respect for human life. It's just honestly, like, you never know what they will do. They're targeting any activist, anyone, honestly. Like, who would go into a house to murder a 7-year-old child, you know?
Well, Aron Aung, I want to thank you for being with us and for your bravery and speaking out. A Burmese student who's come to the U.S. for college, is a senior at the New York Institute of Technology. We will link to your pieces in the Manhattan Globe, among them Misogyny Silenced, Feminism Amplified. Next up today is International Trans Day of Visibility. We'll look at the wave of anti-trans laws that are being enacted across the country. Stay with us.